The NFL has become such a pass heavy league that in today's fantasy football landscape, you could have three wide receivers from the same team that are all fantasy viable. And that can make things super frustrating when trying to set your lineup. So our job is trying to pinpoint which one of those wide receivers are most likely to be successful on a continuous basis. And the best way to do that is to find the most efficient wide receivers in all of football. Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? We continue our volume versus efficiency series, and today we're headed back over to the wide receivers, taking the wide receivers that had more than 100 targets last season and trying to figure out which one of those wide receivers was the most efficient and what does that mean for them potentially in 2024. And as we potentially find out the next breakout candidate at the wide receiver position, there may be some pick'ems that you want to start playing over on Underdog because their season-long pick'ems are now available to start placing. And if you've never done anything over on Underdog before, right now is the perfect time to get started because we can give you a free fantasy football draft guide when you get signed up over on Underdog using code word headliners. All you got to do is download their app or head on over to their website, create a new account and deposit at least $10 using code word headliners. When you use our code word, you're going to get a deposit bonus. You're going to get a special pick'em that's almost guaranteed to hit. And then you're also going to get our 2024 fantasy football draft guide for absolutely free. In the middle of 2024, it's really hard to find a good deal on anything. So you should take advantage of this one. All right, but the time has come. Let's go ahead and jump into our most efficient wide receivers from 2023. And what does that mean for them in 2024? And the first category that we're going to be taking a look at today is going to be catch percentage. Now, instead of breaking down each wide receiver individually, I want to talk as a whole about catch percentage because when I did my running back video the other day, we talked about yards per attempt and how sometimes it's a little bit of a faulty statistic that a lot of people will use just that stat to try and make a point, when in reality, you need to use that stat grouped together with others to paint a whole picture. Catch percentage is exactly the same thing because catch percentage can really go up and down based on a lot of different factors. How accurate is your quarterback? Are the routes that you are running more difficult? Are they contested catches? And unless you go through and you remove uncatchable targets, which has become a category that is tracked these days, you are going to include some of those really bad passing attempts that maybe were not catchable by the wide receiver, or maybe they were potentially catchable and they were just plain bad targets still. And when you take a look at the top 5 names in catch percentage, there's really one name that sticks out, and that's going to be Adam Thielen, especially with the quarterback play last year and how poor that Carolina offense was. And yeah, sometimes drops can be factored in as well. So if you're looking at some of the names at the bottom of the list, it might come to your mind right away, hey, maybe they had a few extra drops than what we would have liked. But also keep in mind that drops and volume go together. The more volume you have, the likely you are to have more drops. A guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown, he had quite a few drops last season. However, he had so much volume that really it offset it, and he still had one of the highest catch percentages in all of football. So yeah, it's the same exact thing I talked about in my running back video the other day when I talked about yards per attempt. Catch percentage is the same way. Let's use this. Let's add it with a few other categories to start painting this picture of overall efficiency. All right, let's move over to yards per target. And I don't want to give anything away for the end of the video, but I will tell you that yards per target is a pretty good indicator of efficiency. And honestly, the guys at the top of this list are absolutely no surprise whatsoever. We know a lot of these guys were big playmakers in 2023. And Brandon Aiyuk and Nico Collins absolutely lead the way. These are two guys that saw big play after big play last season and will likely continue to do the same thing in their offense this coming year as well. Tyreek Hill might be one of the biggest play wide receivers in all of football. I think it is a little bit shocking to see him so high in yards per target just because of how he's utilized all over the field. George Pickens is absolutely an interesting name as well, considering the quarterbacks that he had to play with last season. And Amari Cooper was that big play guy last year for the Cleveland Browns. Will that keep up with Jerry Jeudy though? Now, given the state of the quarterback position for both the Las Vegas Raiders and the New York Jets, Garrett Wilson and Davante Adams at the bottom of yards per target is not shocking whatsoever. I was a little bit shocked to see Stefon Diggs so low though. And I know over in that offense that Gabe Davis last season was really the field stretcher or the big play guy. And Stefon Diggs was utilized a little bit more all over the field. But seeing him this low, barely cracking 7 yards per target with Josh Allen as his quarterback, was extremely concerning. Now, does that have anything to do with Stefon Diggs? Does it have something to do with the offense that he was in? And will that change this season in Houston? That's definitely going to be something that we want to keep our eye on. All right, let's move over to yards per reception. And yards per target absolutely will translate over into this statistic as well. Because when you take a look at the top 10 players in terms of yards per reception, there was only 2 players that were not inside the top 10 of yards per target that bumped up into the top 10 of yards per reception. And the most interesting one is DeAndre Hopkins, who was 23rd in yards per target, but is all the way up to 10th in yards per reception. And what does that mean? Well, statistically, it means that DeAndre Hopkins just took bigger advantage of his catches further down the field. While some of those short yardage passes, yeah, he may be targeted on those, but they didn't end up turning into catches, and it didn't end up turning into his yards per reception either. And with the big arm of Will Levis being the starter in Tennessee this year, that will be something to keep an eye on. However, they have Calvin Ridley now, who will probably be a little bit more of a field stretcher than what DeAndre Hopkins was. So I wouldn't be shocked if his yards per reception end up coming down and he doesn't take advantage of those intermediate routes a little bit more, and Calvin Ridley does the stretching this time. The biggest faller was CeeDee Lamb. He was 9th in yards per target, but fell all the way down to 17th in yards per reception. And I know I've talked about this in some other videos. I'm okay with that. I am okay with CeeDee Lamb not being the big play guy in Dallas. And it's because he's being utilized in the entire route tree and all over the field, which is what you need to do with a wide receiver that is that good and that has the skill set that CeeDee Lamb does. Because early in his career, it was very similar to what Chris Olave was doing last season in New Orleans. They were just sending him on go routes and throwing the ball up to him. So while his yards per target looked really good, and maybe his yards per reception did as well, it didn't end up translating into much for fantasy points. This past year, utilized all over the field and became one of the best wide receivers in fantasy football. Michael Pittman Jr. comes in at the bottom of this list as well, and this only reaffirms some of the things that I've talked about with Michael Pittman Jr., and we'll mention him again at the end of the video. For me personally, he's not a sexy, high upside wide receiver. Maybe you don't want him as your wide receiver 1, but Michael Pittman as a wide receiver 2 is a really good floor wide receiver that when you put in your lineup, you know what you're going to get every single week. You're not going to get a guy that's going to win you very many weeks, but you're going to be getting a guy who gives you consistent fantasy points and honestly just won't contribute to very many of your losses. All right, let's jump into yards after the catch per reception. And I love this statistic as much as I love the running back statistics when you talk about yards after contact. I want those wide receivers that are going to get those yards after the catch. And sometimes one thing you see, especially with the big play wide receivers, is they don't have a ton of yards after the catch. Because with some of those contested catches or some of those balls down the field, you catch them and then you end up going down right away and maybe you don't pick up a whole lot of yards afterwards. But when you look at the top 10 names here and you look at a guy like Nico Collins and George Pickens, yeah, those are guys where it's great to see more yards after the catch per reception because they're doing damage down the field. But it's also good to see a guy like Rashee Rice leading the way as well. And I would love to talk more about him in this video considering how high he's scoring, but it's hard to because we don't even know if he's going to be playing football this year, if he's going to be suspended, if he'll end up missing any chart. We just don't know with Rashee Rice right now. But I can tell you this. If he does end up playing this year with the speed that they have on the outside, if we utilize him in the slot, a lot of the things that we're seeing in this video will translate perfectly. Jaylen Waddle finally cracks the top 10 in his first efficiency category, and we got to see more efficiency out of him. When you have Tyreek Hill playing as well as he is and so much attention garnered to him, you've got to be a little bit more efficient to make up for some of the lack of volume because Tyreek Hill is getting so much. And this may be one of the reasons why he really hasn't taken a step forward to becoming a higher leverage fantasy contributor that we would like to see. Maybe he's going to be a guy that is just a little bit more on the safe side than a little bit more on the high upside side. Now, Drake London so far has been performing pretty low in all of the efficiency categories. And this is just another one where he drops all the way down to the very bottom. The quarterback play, absolutely. The play calling, absolutely. Those are things that 100% contributed to such a poor performance last season. But from an efficiency standpoint, we're still going to need to see a jump this year, because even if he gets all of the volume that we're anticipating and he becomes the #1 wide receiver on that team, if any of these categories are absolutely taking a look at the potential for where his ceiling could go moving forward, it doesn't paint that good of a picture for Drake London. We're going to have to see the volume plus the efficiency for him to really reach the area that a lot of people are betting on. All right, fantasy points per snap. And I talked about this in my running back video the other day, and I'll re-mention it right now. Points per snap is a great way to try and identify guys that are still scoring a lot of fantasy points contributed to the amount of times that they're on the field, because volume is king, right? I have mentioned it in this video series a ton of time, and how a lot of times that doesn't really mean anything. And when people take a look at, oh, player X is on the field a certain amount of snaps, we want him because that's more opportunity for him to score fantasy points, that doesn't always work out to be accurate. And really, there was nothing shocking in this category except for one person, and that's George Pickens. And that's because when we took all of the efficiency categories, George Pickens only finished outside the top 5 in 2 of those areas. And we already talked about catch percentage, which was one of those areas, and how poor targets can lead to a poor catch percentage. He tied for 24th in points per snap. And I don't love to see that, because that means last season he wasn't really getting the amount of targets that we would have liked based on the amount of snaps that he was playing. We've got to get George Pickens more involved in Pittsburgh. He has shown flashes. He has shown potential, the acrobatic catches on the sideline. But they have to make him one of the highest targeted players in all of football this season to really find out whether or not he's got wide receiver 1 upside, or he's just going to be a guy that continues to be someone that takes advantage of those big plays, and outside of that will not be super consistent. All right, points per touch. Once again, the amount of fantasy points that you have divided by the amount of touches you have. And there's one player in particular, and I talked about him in the volume video, that I want to highlight in this category, and it is Jordan Addison. Now, his overall number is not going to be great when we get to the end of this video. And in terms of the category so far, he hasn't scored very high in any of them. But he jumps all the way to 7th in fantasy points per touch. Now, with the quarterback situation in Minnesota this coming year, it will be interesting to see how heavily Jordan Addison is utilized. But I know for a fact that Jordan Addison, given the amount of volume that he got last year, if we can pick up some of these efficiency numbers, he would end up being the next breakout candidate to talk about. And it's going to help him knowing that TJ Hockenson is going to probably miss a good portion of the beginning of the season. And you also don't have KJ Osborne there anymore, taking up some of those potential wide receiver 2 targets. So from an overall standpoint, Jordan Addison doesn't score that great. But from one perspective here, when he does get the football in his hands, he's scoring quite a bit of fantasy points. And that has to do with the amount of touchdowns he scored last year. Now let's just get the ball in his hands a little bit more often. Now, George Pickens, we just talked about how poorly he scored in terms of points per snap, but now he's all the way back up to 5th in terms of points per touch. Once again showing us, yeah, he's on the field an awful lot last season, but when he gets the ball in his hands, he's typically able to do something with it. And Keenan Allen is also an interesting one as well, because he was 4th in points per snap, but he dropped all the way to 26 in points per touch. Couple of reasons for that. Number one, big plays, not really a part of his game. And we know that when it comes to Keenan Allen. This dude is going to just suck up targets all over the middle of the field. He's going to make those catches and he's going to give us solid numbers. But those high upside plays where he's going for 20 or 30 yards at a time isn't really going to happen. And number two, touchdowns. He didn't score a whole lot of touchdowns. The more touchdowns you have, typically you're going to end up finishing a lot higher in points per touch. All right, let's go ahead and talk about the final category now, average finish. And as a reminder, we take all the categories that we talked about in this video, we average out all the stats, and then the lower the average score, the better their efficiency is. And this isn't going to help the Nico Collins hype train at all because he was the most efficient wide receiver last season. Now, let me be very clear on my stance on Nico Collins. I love Nico Collins. Back when he played at Michigan, watched a ton of him. I knew that he could be a good NFL player. Last year, he was one of our top breakout candidates, a sleeper that we told everybody, if you're investing in a wide receiver from Houston, invest in Nico Collins at his ADP. And he absolutely killed it. However, this season, things are getting a little bit out of control. And some of that comes from the big breakout last year. Some of that comes from the new contract he received. And obviously, these numbers are not going to help that at all. But the big difference in Nico Collins is where he's going to be drafted. Last year, you could deal with some of his inconsistencies. And he's going to have inconsistencies because he's the big play threat in this offense. And now that you've added Stefon Diggs and you still have other weapons around him, he's not going to see a consistent amount of targets. There's going to be some weeks where he just disappears. It even happened last season. So be very careful on where you draft him, because the higher you draft him, the less of a value he becomes. And kind of the same thing for Brandon Aiyuk. Brandon Aiyuk has a ton of weapons around him, but he's the big play threat in this offense. Highly efficient, works down the field very, very well. But the higher his ADP goes, the less of a value he becomes for you when you have to deal with some of those inconsistent weeks where the ball is going to go to Debo or George Kittle or Christian McCaffrey instead. While I love seeing both of these guys at the top of this list, we have to be really, really careful on how high we have to draft them. But then you go down the list a little bit in terms of the top performers here in average, and then you find George Pickens. And George Pickens could end up being the Nico Collins of 2024. He's got a really good average draft position. He's not going to cost you a high pick, and he is a guy that you won't have to rely on consistently because when you draft him, he might be like your wide receiver 3. However, he's going to go off some weeks. He's in a much better situation now with his quarterback, and hopefully it translates into more consistent fantasy production. This is the second year in a row that he has finished really high in terms of efficiency. We just need the volume to go with it now. Now, here is where we run into kind of that second category of the most efficient wide receivers. These are the guys that, yeah, we would like to see them be a little bit more efficient, but where they're at right now isn't awful either. Now for Jalen Waddle, I would like to see him take another step in that efficiency this season. So if we're drafting him, we are drafting him as a guy that we're not leaning on to be a safe player in that offense that he's in, but he provides us a little bit more upside with it as well. I think some people are going to be shocked to see Puka Nacua a little bit lower on this list. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing either, because if we get a full healthy season of Cooper Kupp, which is probably debatable at this point, Puka Nacua could see a little bit of a dip in his volume, but a higher percentage of efficiency going forward, knowing that he's got that weapon right next to him on the field. Now, Ja'Marr Chase last season, not great in terms of efficiency. We need to see that number go higher for him as well. And a lot of that is going to hinge on the health of Joe Burrow. There are still some concerns about how exactly his wrist is going to react to that surgery from last season. But if he ends up being fine and 100%, Ja'Marr Chase should jump pretty high in these categories in 2024. All right, I have some beef to pick with one person in particular now that we're into the orange section. But first, Jordan Addison. We already talked about him a minute ago, right? Those touchdowns last season really propelled his points per touch. Unfortunately, due to a little bit of a lack of volume in some other areas though, and not nearly enough playmaking ability with some of those targets that he did receive, those scores are a little bit lower than what we would like, but I do expect some of that to potentially change in 2024, so I'm not off on him yet. DeVonta Smith, though, he continues to be a thorn in my side when I talk about wide receivers, because there are DeVonta Smith truthers. And don't get me wrong, he is a good player. He is a good wide receiver. But you've got A.J. Brown next to you, and you've got Dallas Goedert, and you had a decent run game last season. Why in the world does DeVonta Smith score this low in terms of efficiency? He has to be higher. If he's going to be the number 2 player or the number 2 wide receiver on that team, we need some more efficiency from him. Yeah, he has a big game every once in a while. We need more consistency though. And until we get that, DeVonta Smith is going to be a guy that's going to be either way up here or way down here. Now, you all know my issues with Chris Olave. It's not Chris Olave, it's the offense that he's in. I'm going to be doing a video kind of discussing that in the coming weeks that you're going to want to make sure that you tune into, because I've got some really good information for all of you. I'm not writing Chris Olave off just yet. Now, Zay Flowers is a little bit more interesting that he finished so low here. Pretty decent in catch percentage, but that was the only category that he finished top 10 in. His next best score was 11. This year, he really does need to take a big step forward. He's got plenty of weapons around him. So even if the volume isn't that high, he should be seeing some one-on-one coverage, and he should be utilized in a little bit better of a position to make sure that his efficiency can end up rising a lot higher. All right, and now we drop to the very bottom of the list. Again, Garrett Wilson, Davante Adams, we've talked about those guys. Quarterback play was awful last season. Adam Thielen, we've talked about him. The offense as a whole was not that great last season. Tyler Lockett, a little concerning he's this low given the amount of playmakers that are around him. We need to see him do a lot better down the field this season. Drake London, he's going to see an increase in volume this year, or at least he should, but we need to see an increase in the efficiency as well. If the efficiency doesn't rise and he continues to stay in this area, then you're going to be drafting a wide receiver that you hope for wide receiver 1 output, but really you're only going to get wide receiver 2 output. Calvin Ridley. I don't really anticipate a ton from Calvin Ridley this year. I do expect him to be a guy that is going to have some boom or bust games again with Will Levis at quarterback, but I don't expect him to be any more consistent than what he was last year in Jacksonville. Stefon Diggs, his efficiency needs to get better this season, and hopefully being in a new offense with playmakers all around him and a little bit of a different atmosphere now in Houston, he'll be able to do that, and he can get back to being an efficient wide receiver, because his volume will absolutely take a hit. And then Terry McLaurin. The Washington offense for me is really a gamble. Jaden Daniels could be the difference maker, and the playmaker that he is could end up transforming this offense and bringing Terry McLaurin back up to a fantasy viable wide receiver every single week. But I still have concerns on how consistent that offense may be. All right, Headliner Nation, there you have it, talking about the most efficient wide receivers from 2023 and what it could mean moving forward. And next week, we're gonna wrap this series up by talking about the wide receivers that had the biggest difference from their volume to their efficiency. So do me a favor, if you enjoyed this video and you haven't caught the rest of this series, make sure you go back and watch the videos that I've already done. Make sure you subscribe and turn turn on the bell notifications. Anytime we drop new content or go live, you'll know about it right away. And obviously, leave me some comments down below and let me know if you're enjoying this series and if you've got any questions about any of the information that we presented today. But for now, Headliner Nation, I'm gonna get out of here. YouTube's gonna recommend a video to you that you may have missed recently. If you did miss it, click on it right now. Peace out, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.